Today is the anniversary of the second and final day of the Battle of Bannockburn, which happened in 1314. Let's learn a little bit about how did Robert the Bruce kill Henry de Bohun with his axe. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, as mentioned, today is the 24th of June, so it's the anniversary of the 1314 Battle of Bannockburn, which is one of the most important battles in Scottish history, and in fact, I would say one of the most notable battles in medieval history in general. It's most notable, of course, for it being very important in the Scottish Wars of Independence, the First Scottish War of Independence. There's a lot of myths around the battle. Contrary to, I think, what a lot of people think, it didn't, like in one fell swoop, end English designs on controlling Scotland in that period at all. There was about another 14 years of wrangling before that phase was wrapped up. But one of the things which is most notable about the battle actually is the fact that a relatively small Scottish force, if we trust current research, of about 6,000–7,000 Scottish soldiers, drawn from various parts of Scotland, it has to be said, defeated an army of about 25, possibly even more thousand English army. Now, we also have to mention medieval armies aren't quite as clear-cut as our modern perception of national armies. There weren't only English people on the English side. In fact, there weren't only Scottish people on the Scottish side. And of course, what does Scottish and English mean in that period? Something that's important to note is that the Scots language, the key source we're going to look at in this video, the Scots language is actually a form of Anglo-Saxon English. It's a Germanic language, and at this time, Scottish sources written in the native language were basically the same language as Northern English. So equally within Scotland, there were different dialects, and there were even different languages being spoken. Rather than the kind of modern, rather Hollywood-ized version of history whereby this was one nation trying to subjugate another nation, it wasn't as simple as that at all. This was about a war between nobles. Think Game of Thrones. And in fact, Robert the Bruce had many common ancestors with Edward II, who he fought against and defeated at the Battle of Bannockburn. Even if we look at William Wallace, who doesn't feature in this because he was dead by this point, but William Wallace equally had relatives and common ancestors with these people as well. So what we're really talking about here is a war between nobles. It's a war between different noble houses for control of a territory. Okay, so put aside some of the Hollywood ideas of this period. Now, the Battle of Bannockburn was incredibly important, as mentioned. It was very pivotal in the wars between Robert the Bruce and Edward II in this case, but it was also incredibly notable because it was an absolutely astounding victory for Robert the Bruce, with a far smaller army, with very assertive tactics and aggressive tactics, really catching a far larger and, you could say, militarily superior foe, catching them at the right moment, at the right time, exploiting the circumstances, and basically breaking the opponent's morale to fight and causing them to flee. The other thing I want to say as well, with all medieval battles, don't think about all of the enemy being destroyed and killed and all of that kind of stuff. Very often, victory is dictated by which side runs away first, and that was pretty much the case here as well. Not to say there weren't lots of casualties, there were, but the majority of people who were involved in the battle on either side survived to tell the tale. Now, one of the famous episodes that happened in the Battle of Bannockburn that certainly every Scottish kid in school, I should think, learns about, is this single combat that was a sort of prelude to the main battle that occurred between Robert the Bruce himself, allegedly on a small palfrey riding horse and lightly armoured, against a heavily armoured, on a large, I won't say destrier, but a large war horse, Henry de Bohun. And there is this stereotypical idea in people's minds, because it plays into the mythology mythology of the time, I suppose, of essentially the Robert the Bruce, the outlaw king, in lesser armour, lesser equipped, with nothing but an axe, felling the absolute height of chivalry of its day. And, you know, a knight in full armour, at this time a mixture of mail and plate. We'll talk more about the armour in a second. On the biggest horse, you know, using a lance. So the English knight theoretically had all the advantages, and but Robert the Bruce, because he had, I don't know, God or right or a strong arm on his side, felled him with one blow with an axe. Now, where does this idea come from? Well, I started looking into this because I thought, you know, what's the actual source material for this? And actually there isn't very much source material for this. It essentially comes from one later 14th century, circa 1375, we'll look at the source in a minute, source that is Scottish. There are other sources that talk about this battle and that talk about even this incident, and it is clear that Henry de Bohun did die and Robert the Bruce did win, and there seems to have been some form of involvement between the two. So we'll never know 100% exactly what happened, but I think on balance of probability based on the sources, it does seem that either Robert the Bruce or his men, or a group of his men, did catch or kill Henry de Bohun somehow. That definitely happened. The question is, how did it happen? And the answer is we'll never know 100% for sure, but the stereotypical version of the story is this. If you get any sort of like an Osprey book on the Battle of Bannockburn, or any kind of casual history, a Wikipedia page, anything like this, this is how it went. The two people, so Robert the Bruce and Henry de Bohun, saw each other, and Henry de Bohun saw his chance to kill Robert the Bruce, and he lowered his lance and charged, at which point Robert the Bruce, using guile and nimbleness or something, avoided, on his horse, on horseback, avoided the lance strike of Henry de Bohun, and standing up in his stirrups, struck Henry de Bohun through his helmet. Now, we'll talk about helmets in a minute. This is not the correct type of helmet, but I will hold it to give you an idea. Struck his axe through the helmet, straight into the head of Henry de Bohun, and killed him with one blow. Now, we'll talk more in a second about the practicalities of actually striking an axe through a helmet, and what types of helmets and what type of axe in a second. But first of all, where does this idea that pervades pretty much all modern history books, where does it actually come from? What's the source material? So I put my glasses on. The source is the Bruce, talking about Robert the Bruce, and it's specifically from Book 12, lines 40 to 86 is the section that deals with this. Now, this is written in, and I quote, it's written in an older form of Scots language, and it says, which in the 14th century had much in common with Northern English, both being variants of Northumbrian Anglo-Saxon. Scots, though, had already begun to diverge and develop into a distinctly Scottish tongue, and Barber's Bruce, represents its acceptance as the Scottish Royal Court, at the Scottish Royal Court, as the language of literature and high status. So whether that's interesting to you or not, I think it's interesting to note that Scots language is a form of Northumbrian Anglo-Saxon. Remember that Edinburgh for a time was part of Northumbrian Anglo-Saxon England, and it was the official court language. But also remember that most nobles in Scotland at this time would have spoken French as well, because a lot of the Scottish nobles were Anglo-Norman descent, just like English nobles were as well. So French was still the lingua franca internationally, but in the 14th century we start to see vernacular languages becoming accepted in the courts of their countries. So for example, English accepted under Edward III particularly, but I think it was starting to happen before that, hence Chaucer's written English, but equally Scots language was accepted at the court in Scotland. So this is the bit of the language. Now, I am going to try my best to read it as I see it on the page. My pronunciation will be wrong, my understanding of some of the words will be non-existent, but I will then read a modern English translation or interpretation of these words. So in the words of 14th century Scots, it says, "And when the king saw apertly, saw him come forth, all his ferris, in he till him the horse he steris. And when Sir Henry saw the king come on forotin, abasing, till him he rade in full great he thocht, and then he sold well lichty, win him and have him at his will, sen him host so sail, sprent thy salmon intil aling, Sir Henry missit the noble king, and he that in his stirrup stood with the axe that was hard and good, with so great main raked him a dint, that nother hat na helm nicked stint. The heavy dus that he him gave, that ne'er the heat till the harness clave. The hand axe shaft frushed in twa, and he donned to the erd gan gar. And falatis for him fallit mict. So as you see, language has changed quite a lot in the British Isles, more so than in many other countries, France, Italy, for example. 14th century Italian, modern Italians, even me, can read relatively easily. If you try and read Chaucer in its original form, you'll find a similar problem with this. But you'll also notice this is rhyming verse. Now, let's move over to the translation, which will be a lot more understandable for you. It says, and when the king saw him, Bohun, that is, moving towards him in sight of his comrades, he hastily turned his horse towards him. And when Sir Henry saw the king come on quite abashed, he rode at him full speed. He thought to beat him easily, and gave him at the disadvantage, because the king was lightly horsed. There's the reference to the palfrey, perhaps a lighter, a smaller riding horse. So it doesn't mention armour at this point. So they closed on one another. Sir Henry missed the noble king. It doesn't mention a lance. It doesn't say what he's using. And he, the king, that is, stood in his stirrups. So that's mentioned in lots of modern tertiary sources. With an axe both hard and good. Where's the axe? With an axe both hard and good. Struck him such a great blow that neither hat or helmet could stop. The heavy clout he gave, so he cleaved the head to the brains. The hand axe shaft broke in two, and he, Bohun, fell to the ground, dead and devoid of all strength now. This was the first blow of the battle. And there we go. So that's essentially where this story gets told and told and told over and over and over again, basically comes from. It's a later, so 1375, so we're talking 61 years later, than the actual battle. So that's 2 generations at least, possibly in the medieval period you could call that 3 generations. Was this true or not? I think there's a good chance that something like this happened. However, there is an English source which actually describes de Bohun during scouting or whatever being spotted, chased down and killed by the enemy. So this is the kind of ideal Scottish national hero mythologized version of the story, but that's not to say it didn't happen. It's possible that this is what happened, and the English didn't just recount this either because they didn't know about it, because there only would have been Scottish witnesses to this probably, or because they didn't want to talk about it because that wasn't a battle we like to talk about. Those aren't events that we like to talk about in England because it's about our defeat. So now let's talk about the mechanical practicalities from my sort of knowledge base and my experience. So there were various types of axe being used in the early part of the 14th century. This is a replica by Thor's Forge of a 14th century Swedish axe, and absolutely the Bruce's axe could have looked exactly like this. If we look at things like the Holcomb Bible, which is also early 14th century, I think about 1320, so similar in date, we see axes similar to this. They've got a spike on the back, they've got an axe on one side. Not to say there was necessarily a spike. There were axes being used at this time which only had a blade. There was some which had a hammer at the back at this point. They're not quite evolved into the later kind of end of the 14th century style of sort of poleaxe head that we know. They tend to be more simple like this. So they tend to be more developed than a Viking era or kind of Crusades era axe, but there are and they've usually got a spike at the back. But it could equally be a two-handed axe. There's no definite guarantee that it's a one-handed axe. My guess, if I had to bet money on it, would be that it was a one-handed axe, because usually in the early 14th century, knightly type people went around with a one-handed sword or axe or mace and a shield. Most people carried shields at this point, so most particularly for horsemen, most weapons were one-handed. So probably a one-handed axe, not definitely. Probably something like this, but not definitely. And the other thing we have to say is this source, if we only take this source in isolation, although it says it's an axe and we know that its shaft broke in two, so we know it's got a wooden shaft, which is normal for this time, we don't know definitely that he struck with the axe blade. If it was an axe exactly like this, and I think there's a good chance that it could be, he could absolutely have struck with that. And so a lot of people, when they've done reconstructive artwork or descriptive accounts, have had the axe blade striking into someone's helmet and cutting through a helmet. Well, if you are striking plate armour, quite clearly the bit which is designed best to penetrate or compromise armour in any way is the point. The axe blade's great against flesh and horses and stuff like that, and even gambesons and stuff like that, but the spike is much better equipped. Now, let's talk about the helmets. What type of helmet could have been worn at this time? Well, a lot of reconstructive artwork and interpretations have had Henry de Bohun wearing a great helm. Now, there are a few problems with that if this story is true, if this is completely true as it's written. Firstly, a great helm is very difficult to compromise and certainly get into someone's brain, as it's described in the text, with an axe or sword or any other type of weapon like that. You're just, for the most part, not going to be able to penetrate through it. Perhaps the only thing which might stand a slight chance, if you're really strong and really lucky, and maybe if the horse is moving at speed, is the spike. Certainly not the axe blade. Now, there's another big problem with the idea of striking an axe, whether it's with a point or a blade, through a great helm at this period, and that is that great helms were usually worn, pretty much always worn actually, over either a mail coif and or a male with a cevalier or bassinet underneath the great helm. That's right, that's essentially two helmets, okay? So not only have you got to get through the great helm, but you've got to get through the helmet that's underneath the great helm, which itself usually has an attached aventail or mail to it as well. So that seems hugely, hugely unlikely. And although it is shown in some medieval art, cutting through or piercing helmets, this is generally accepted to be a heroic rendition, usually biblical or mythological representations of warfare by artists who don't actually know very much about weapons and armour. So, what is the likelihood that Robert the Bruce penetrated a great helm and the bassinet or cevalier underneath, possibly also a mail coif if there's a cevalier being worn over or under a mail coif, and all of those 2 or 3 layers of steel or iron? I think very, very, very unlikely. Okay, not to say completely impossible, because we've got to take into consideration here the material. Very slaggy content wrought iron is much softer than modern mild steel and more likely to fracture or break. Additionally, you can have freak blows that do things that you just wouldn't normally expect. It sometimes happens. There's that 1 in a million shot. However, unlikely. But there's a couple of other possibilities at this period. One is that Henry de Bohun wasn't wearing a great helm. Now, if this story is true, if we take the Bruce text at face value, I actually think that this is the most likely explanation and scenario. Now, great helms, although it looks great in art to have your enemy in a big, fearsome looking great helms often weren't worn when action wasn't expected to be imminent. Now, importantly, some massive context I'm going to insert into you right now. At this stage in the battle, if we take all of the text that we've got available as correct, then Henry de Bohun was not prepared for action. He was scouting around, riding around, and he happened chanced upon the Scottish forces, and that's the point at which there was an encounter between him and Robert the Bruce. So it's entirely possible that Henry de Bohun did lower his lance, did charge, but he only had on his head either a mail coif with padding underneath, or a bassinet or cevalier with a mail aventail and or coif. So in that scenario, is it possible that Robert the Bruce's axe, maybe the spike rather than the blade, could pierce the helmet of a cevalier or bassinet helmet or a mail coif? Yes, that's more possible. Okay, that's entirely more plausible. And I think if we take the Bruce source at face value, and that's actually what happened in this encounter, that de Bohun didn't have his great helm on, he only had a Sevelier and a mail coif, then in that scenario, I think it's entirely possible that an axe could have penetrated through whatever hat or helmet, as the source says, that he was wearing, and penetrated his brain. So to sum up, do I think that this story is true? I think that it's possible that it is. I think that it is possible that the Bruce had an encounter with Henry de Bohun. We know for certain that Henry de Bohun did die, and we know that the Bruce didn't. We know that it was a successful battle. The problem is there's so much mythology and, frankly, in the modern world, so much BS and lies spread around the Scottish Wars of Independence, and the sort of, shall I call it, the Mel Gibson effect of transposing a modern idea of nationalism onto the medieval world, which was very often wars between nobles with their followers and retainers. It wasn't national wars in the modern sense. That I think it's very difficult to penetrate through some of the myths and legends that pertain and surround these characters, particularly Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. And it has to be said, Edward I and Edward II and Edward III as well. But do I think it's possible? Yes, absolutely, I think it's possible. What I think is very, very unlikely and practically impossible is that Robert the Bruce killed Henry de Bohun with chopping with an axe blade through a great helm and what was ever underneath the great helm, which would have been usually another helmet as well. I think that's practically impossible. Okay, that's just complete fantasy. What I think is more likely is that the Bruce used the backside of an axe with a spike to penetrate either a mail coif, because Henry de Bohun wasn't wearing his great helm at the time, or the Sevelier, which is the helmet which goes underneath, a proto-bassinet or even an early bassinet, underneath the great helm. The other possibility, of course, is that he didn't have a great helm. In 1314, it was becoming increasingly common for knights and men-at-arms to wear forms of what had been under helmet, in other words, the bassinet, entirely by themselves. So the other possibility is that he was wearing a wrought iron bassinet with an aventail attached, either with or without a visor, and that with one clean blow, because you're now only going through one layer of steel, maybe 2 millimeters thick, and if it's iron, it's not even as strong as mild steel, and it's medieval iron as well, and it then becomes possible and plausible that with a strong blow, especially on horseback with the movement of the horses, collision speed involved, that perhaps Robert the Bruce did get the point of an axe through a helmet and into his brain. So yes, it's possible. I'm not here to debunk it, but I've explained what I think is the most plausible and believable way that this might have actually gone down all those centuries ago. So happy Bannockburn Day, if we call it that, 24th of June 1314. Don't forget the year 1314, Battle of Bannockburn, very important in British, English and Scottish history. But I would say this battle is worth studying for anyone interested in medieval warfare, because it's really, really interesting in tactical terms and quite significant really on how the history of the British Isles panned out, which of course affected everyone else in Europe by and large as well in the long run. Thanks a lot for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't done, and give this video a like, share it around, send it to a friend who you think might appreciate it, and hopefully I'll see you back on the channel again soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.